Let me just quickly correct a couple of points that were made in the introduction to my introduction. First, I assumed this presentation was associated with the causes of the ongoing economic crisis, not the post-economic crisis period. And the presentation is therefore around the proposition that the crisis is still very much with us, needs to be explained and needs to be managed. Secondly, this presentation is not going to offer you a normative case for redistributive policies, but a technical case for redistributive policies. What I want to argue today is that while the neoliberal approach has always claimed that austerity cuts and similar kinds of transfers of resources from poor people to rich people are required by economic technical arguments, I'm going to try to present you with an argument that presents exactly the opposite point of view. That without redistributive processes, capitalism as a system is not going to survive in any serious kind of way. Now, I start by identifying what seems to me to be a significant contradiction in the global policy stance, a contradiction that I think came out very well as well in the earlier paper. That is to say, we live increasingly in a world dominated by a neoclassical theory that argues that allowing markets to operate is the best way of maximizing both technological change, growth, and also stability and equity. And I'll talk a little bit in a while about what the technical basis for those claims actually are. Yet, as we've already seen in the United States case, we actually live in a world in which actual policy practice is increasingly dominated by a wide range of state-led redistributive policies that have been massively increased in response to the crisis. If we look at the way in which the global capitalist system responded to the crisis, we can see a whole series of systematic interventions. Bank bailouts to start with, state-led austerity packages to stop deficit countries from defaulting, negative interest rates imposed by the economic authorities to make it possible for people to continue to invest in a context in which investment opportunities were being squeezed, quantitative easing, otherwise known as money printing, unsustainable deficits in the USA. We've heard about the fact that whatever technological growth is taking place in the USA is driven by state-led intervention. Let's be very clear that without the Obama deficit programs, which no other country in the world would be allowed to get away with, the Americans have run both balance of payments and fiscal deficits over the past, in fact, 20 to 30 years, that the IMF would have been forced to intervene to correct in any other country. Only these have been sustaining significant levels of demand in the global economy and reducing the tendency towards the sort of recession that took place in the 1930s. And I've seen that recently there's massive state-led infrastructure investment in China, which many commentators assume is financially unsustainable, that has also been one of the elements that has created the possibility of, if not a recovery from crisis, at least the possibility of managing the crisis. Now, these interventions contradict basic market principles. They are treated as short-term expedients. They have not been produced, the effects they produced in the 1930s, when the crisis led to a very widespread, indeed almost universal shift from liberal policies where those still actually existed to interventionist policies, many of them, of course, of an extremely damaging and destructive kind. Instead, these policies are treated as short-term expedients that are being adopted to deal with failures of government, failures of economic regulation, that once they're corrected, once these societies have shifted, like Greece or Italy, once corruption has stopped, once people have stopped creating the problems, once they've adopted proper market regulations as set out by neoliberal theory, then of course the crisis can come to an end and we can return to where we should have been all along, which is to say operating on the basis of neoliberal theory. Now, what I want to do today is to show how these claims need to be challenged, and I would do so by trying to re-establish the basis for their challenge using the tradition that I've been involved in for many, many years. I might say, since we're all referring to our own work here, the work that I'm speaking to here, I wrote in the early 1980s when I was talking about international money and capitalist crisis and the world economy since the war, where I clearly predicted that if neoliberal policies were adopted to get away from structuralism, this must lead to a major capitalist crisis. Unfortunately, my predictions were a little early. They came only 20 years later. But it seems to me that those arguments do actually help one to understand why we've had the breakdown that we've suffered from. Now, what I want to do is first of all to talk about what the basic arguments are that make it possible for liberals to make these claims about the equilibrating tendencies of market systems. And I think it's important to start with this, because the argument that I want to make today is not an argument against the role and importance and indeed power of market systems as mechanisms for generating growth, for generating innovation, for creating the basis indeed for civilized life in general. What I want to do is start by making it clear that there are very, very powerful and reasonable claims that lie behind these arguments, that we have to take these seriously, and that the critical problem that we need to do is to recognize the limitations that arise out of a very particular problem, which is to say the problem of scale economies and technological change that makes it possible to generate increasing output with declining employment. So just very briefly, most neoliberal economists do not actually use these arguments. They simply assume that markets necessarily produce growth as well as stability and equity, that is to say full employment. But indeed these arguments do rest on very important bodies of theory. I show here, I think, the key theories that we can identify are Say's theory of full employment. Say argues that we can demonstrate that any competitive economy will soon generate full employment, because since supply creates its own demands and supply creates the money that is required to buy the product that's produced, and given that profits drive people to continue to invest, then if we allow markets to operate, the normal market competition will continue to the point where there's full employment and rising wages make it impossible to go any further. At that point, wages will stagnate. They will either go down and then rise again, but whatever the case is, we can assume that full employment is a natural condition of competitive capitalism. Secondly, of course, this principle has to operate at the global level, and Hume's theory of the balance of payments demonstrates that no country can maintain a long-term balance of payment surplus and thereby impose deflationary pressures on a weaker country, because very quickly, that long-term balance of payment surplus will increase the demand for labor, increase consumption within the surplus country, increase costs, and thereby make it possible for the weaker country to start exporting again. And that theory feeds into Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, because what Ricardo shows is that with full employment, a country that maximizes its production of its lower cost product will eventually be able to compete with the higher cost product producer, because that producer will benefit by buying the lower cost product and increasing the production of its own lower cost products. And finally, for development theorists, Arthur Lewis's model of the labor surplus economy has been a critical variable, because what that shows is that to the extent that there is underemployed and low-cost labor in poor regions, we can expect in a world in which, in a world with open flows of capital, we can expect capital to flow from the high-cost region to the low-cost region and make it possible for that area to increase its employment until full employment operates on a global level. And indeed, it's important to not deny these arguments, because, of course, if we think about, in fact, the presentation that we had a few moments ago, we see there that what we have experienced over the past 20 or 30 years is a massive flow of capital out of the advanced industrialized world into third world countries, and indeed a massive process of deindustrialization across the advanced countries, including the United States. And I think it's important to note, when we consider the significance of these principles, that they do demonstrate the dangers of what I would call inappropriate interventions to redistribute resources. Protectionism, for example, in advanced countries clearly significantly reduced the capacity for industrialization in third world countries, overvalued exchange rates in countries with balance of payments deficits in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, clearly contributed to the economic crisis that occurred there. So we cannot ignore those arguments, and we have to keep them in the back of our mind before we make any critique of them. And finally, just very briefly, of course, the critical point about neoliberal theory is that it actually does require a strong state. So the neoliberal argument is not an argument for a weak state. The neoliberal argument is an argument for a strong regulatory state. What this model tells us is we need a state that deals with critical issues that can't be dealt with by markets, notably property rights, but also various other kinds of access to open access resources, negative and positive externalities, and indeed the need for safety nets and merit goods that can't be dealt with through the normal competitive process. However, if we buy all of that, we're still left with a problem, and that problem is the world does not look the way it should look if those principles actually apply. If we look very broadly, and I'm not an econometrician, in fact I can't read an equation, and I'm about as good as maths as I am at PowerPoint, we see that the world doesn't look like that. The world looks very different. The world is characterized by what I call uneven development. That is to say, a long-term process in which inequality has been consistent, has been for the most part continuous. That is to say, the countries that were the advanced countries that led the world at the end of the 19th century are all still at the top end of the global hierarchy. What has happened in between has been some shift in that, notably, of course, over the past 40 years, with the shift of industrialization to East Asia, partly driven by the opening of global markets, but also importantly driven by structuralist interventionist policies in those countries, as indeed the development of the new centers of growth in the 19th century in Europe were driven, that probably would certainly not have operated in the same kind of way, and certainly would not have generated the same levels of equalization. Indeed, I would also argue that the period of maximum stability and growth in the 20th century, as I think Piketty's book shows, I have yet to read it, is the period immediately after the Second World War, which was indeed a period dominated by structuralist interventionist policies and not by neoliberal market policies. Thus, we have a problem. We can demonstrate that if certain conditions apply, the world should benefit by open economic competition, and certainly if we compare the world in the 1990s and early 2000s with the world in the 1930s and 1940s, we can see a massive improvement in people's both security, stability, growth, and all of those kinds of things, compared with a period dominated by fascist and Stalinist command economies, beggar thy neighbor policies, and all of those kinds of things. So what is it that makes it possible for inequality to not only continue, but to increase, and by increasing, to intensify instability and insecurity? The reason why uneven development, in which a surplus country, or indeed a number of surplus firms within a country, benefit at the expense of others, is that will very rapidly destroy the consumption capacity of the people who lose their jobs, and by doing so eventually create a deflationary spiral which will undermine the possibility of capitalist development in the future. That seems to me to be what happened in 1930. It also was, more importantly, what happened in 1907, 1908, when the capacity of expanding consumption through credit creation reached its limit, and we have had the subsequent 5 years or 6 years of deflation. Now, I'm already running short of time. Let me just make my claim for my technical argument. I argue here, and I argued in those books and in the paper that you can access on the LSE website that accompanies this presentation, that the critical variable that neoclassical and liberal classical theorists ignore is the existence of increasing returns to scale. We can demonstrate technically that if we have a situation, a globe, an industry, a sector, where the possibility exists of continuous increases in output and production and continuous declines in cost through the adoption of technologies that depend on growing economies of scale, to the extent that those technical conditions exist, the possibility of a free competitive market must collapse. Competitive markets depend upon the existence, in the last analysis, of constant or declining returns to scale. Now, that is an assumption that is built into the liberal model, but it seems to me that it is an assumption that is totally at variance with the most powerful and important technological variables that drive the modern economy. The modern economy has been critically driven by massive expansions in technological capacity that are associated with scale, that increase the productivity of individual workers, reduce the demand for labor, and simultaneously enable the producer that produces more goods to reduce costs and thereby wipe out the producer that doesn't have the resources that make it possible for them to adopt those technologies. We saw that with the beginning of Fordism at the beginning of the 19th century. We're seeing this process operating on an even more intense scale with the automation technologies that wiped out workers across many, many sectors over the past 20 years. And indeed, the internet and information technologies are making the same thing possible. Very briefly, it's important to recognize that scale economies are not just something that operate at the level of an individual plant. It is indeed the case that Henry Ford's plant, making the Model T Ford, did in fact destroy probably 100 firms, 100 motor car firms in Britain. But these scale economies also operate at the level of firms. Scale economies enable large firms to get better access to credit, to research, to marketing, and indeed to political influence than small ones, and therefore increase their competitiveness. And perhaps most important of all, in terms of the global issues that we're discussing today, scale economies also operate at the level of regions where access to infrastructure, access to high levels of human and social and indeed political capital make it possible for established regions to outcompete less established regions. Nobody is going to build their next motor car plant in Kitgum in northern Uganda, I can assure you, even though you can buy labor there for $1 a week and not for $10 an hour as you have to pay them here. So where you have these economies of scale, what we end up with is not free, perfect competition, but oligopolistic competition that reshapes the world with rapid growth and continuous innovation in successful areas and increasing inequality, marginalization, and crisis in unsuccessful areas. So this theory, which Schumpeter derived from Marx, and I now refer to as Schumpeterian theory rather than Marxist theory, since it's much less fashionable to be a Marxist now than it was when I wrote my books in the 1980s, provides us with a much more realistic view of the dynamic processes that reshape global growth than the liberal model. And it is these processes that demonstrate why redistributive policies are a necessary technical response to uneven development. Because unless these policies are adopted, we end up with a deflationary spiral, we end up with a crisis, and we end up with a world that in 1930 confronted a devastating long-term crisis, and that confronted the same crisis in 2007, 2008, and was only rescued from it by the redistributive processes that I've mentioned to you. Now, I've only got very few minutes left, and so I'll just make a few brief comments about the policy implications of these propositions. First of all, we can see that market failure has necessarily led to massive interventionist policies. Polanyi, of course, argued famously that most interventionist policies were not produced by left-wing people, by demands from left-wing people, but by demands from capitalists and others who wanted the state to rescue them from the crisis, from their own problems. So the starting point of a policy response is that we've got to recognize that intervention will produce positive results in well-managed states, but destructive ones in regressive ones, and that markets are a necessary component of any solution that we're trying to look for. So what we could spend the whole of these 3 days talking about the implications and the complexities and difficulties associated with negotiating one's way through these kinds of traps. Indeed, I think that is what will probably be going on here for a lot of the time. I can't go into any of those details, which, as I keep saying to you, I have dealt with in part elsewhere, and would be very happy if you would go and buy my books, even the last one I wrote in 2009, where I try to produce a sort of generalized response to this. I just make a few basic points. First, we've got to recognize the benefits of market-based systems. We've got to recognize that markets do unlock the blockages to technological change imposed by regressive collective controls, that they facilitated the growth in productivity and consumption that has rescued most people from destitution. We also have to recognize that the scale increasing technologies aren't the only process operating. Scale reducing technologies also have the opposite effect than those that I've described. They have enabled small firms and isolated regions to compete with established ones. We all know about the Ugandan peasant running around with his mobile phone getting a better price for his grain. And indeed, increased output in high technology sectors does generate additional demands from people in low technology sectors, like the Ugandan grain producer who's now selling his grain to China for a much higher price than he would have got before. We also know that this is not an excuse for irrational and coercive status policies, like Stalinist planning or fascist war economies. And fourthly, that it is only because of the beneficial effects of scale economies that modern societies have been able to build the capacity to protect their citizens, to provide welfare services, indeed to generate the surpluses needed to create the redistributive processes that are needed to correct the effects of structuralist policies. So any solution that we're looking for, we have got to try to protect the ability of the market to continue to develop that. Okay, so just a few final points. State regulations that simply enables markets to work better will actually not eliminate uneven development, even though it may well improve the possibilities of countries that are operating under bad management. Italy, Greece. We can't blame everything that was going on there on the effects of market competition, because clearly there was a whole array of governance issues that affected. Secondly, we need different kinds of policies in different kinds of contexts. Chronic surplus countries need to cut their surpluses. Chronic deficit countries need to increase their export surpluses. Late developing countries need far more support to build up, to go through the early industrialization period. They need protection and so on. And indeed, redistribution has to be managed at the global level. The assumption that the poverty of an informal sector worker in Nigeria is purely national is nonsense in the context where the reason why that person has lost his livelihood is because of cheap imports of, I don't know, mass-produced shoes from China. So unless we have a mechanism at the global level that forces surplus countries to export less and import more, unless we change the current IMF's regulations that impose massive pressures on deficit countries to reduce their consumption and put no pressure on surplus countries to reduce their surpluses, unless we can deal with that problem, we can't make any claims about the justice in the global system. And finally, let me simply say that uncontrolled markets must necessarily generate an environmental catastrophe of such massive dimensions that social life as we know will be impossible within, at the very most, the next 100 years. I'm very concerned about the future of my grandchildren. And I have no solutions to that. So that's my technical response to the problem of unequal development. Let me simply finish on a pessimistic note. These recommendations have been expunged from the policy agenda since the early 1980s. They have radical political implications. The last time I think they were seriously on the agenda in Britain was in 1983, when the Labour Party manifesto, otherwise known as the longest suicide note in history, was produced. I have to confess to you that I was a member of the team that wrote that manifesto, and I've been involved in Labour Party policy ever since, but I don't have any expectations that the social democratic consciousness that exists in this country, given the elimination of the industrial working class that created that possibility, still exists. I simply leave you with the proposition that this analysis, at the very least, does enable us to prove that the moral need for a redistributive economy isn't the only and even the most important force behind it. Unless we have a redistributive policy that offsets uneven development, the capitalist system itself is destined for failure. Thank you.